Meet the amazing Madrigals. There is Peppa, who controls the weather with her mood. Her sister, Julieta, can heal any illness or injury with the food she cooks. The next generation is no less gifted. Dolores can hear sounds a mile away. Camilo can shape, shift, and disguise himself as anyone he wants. Luisa has superhuman strength, and the perfect beauty Isabella can make flowers bloom out of nowhere. Abuela is the matriarch of the family. A long time ago, Abuela received a miracle. A magical town in their native Colombia, their Encanto, a town surrounded by high mountains to keep her and her family safe. A magic house, casita, whose stairs and windows and drawers and floors respond to the family's every need. And a candle, eternally burning, representing the magic of the family itself, each member with their own magical gift. This, as you may have picked up on, is the cast of Disney's latest hit movie, Encanto, at least most of the cast. If you haven't seen it, that's okay. I am sending you some video links from the movie over the next couple weeks in your e-note so that you can have some idea of what I'm talking about if you don't. If you don't get the e-note, then I encourage you to just do a little searching on YouTube if you can. That or subscribe to Disney Plus for a month. I promise it will be worth it. Abuela, as we learn, takes this miracle seriously. Her children and grandchildren's gifts are not simply valued for the sake of fun or power. Rather, it's her family's solemn responsibility to use their gifts for the common good of their town, to help others, and to prove that they are worthy of this blessing that they have received. And so, if she sometimes puts her family under a lot of pressure, that's why. There are still a few members of the family that I didn't mention yet. There is Peppa and Julieta's brother, Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno. There is Antonio, the youngest Madrigal, who is about to have his coming-of-age ceremony where he will receive his own magical gift. And there is Mirabel, the hero of our story. Mirabel is the only person in the family Madrigal who did not receive a gift. And she has made it her mission since then to prove her worth and usefulness as part of the family. The story opens on the day of Antonio's gift ceremony. The mood is celebratory, but there's also this underlying unspoken tension. Everyone remembers what happened last time at Mirabel's ceremony, where she did not receive a gift. For Antonio, however, all goes as planned. He opens his magical door and all of a sudden he's able to communicate with animals. We see Abuela breathe a visible sigh of relief. The magic is still at work. That night, though, while the rest of the family celebrates, Mirabel sees Casita begin to crack. By the time she calls for Abuela, everything is normal again. Mirabel, however, sets out to discover what's really going on with her family, just what it all has to do with her Tio Bruno, and how she can save the family's magic. The Madrigals remind me, in some ways, of a story the Bible tells about another family who received a miraculous blessing. The story starts with a shepherd boy named David, the youngest of 8 brothers, who in his own anointing ceremony is improbably chosen over all of them to be king of Israel. Now, David doesn't become king right away. Instead, he finds his way into the court of King Saul, proves himself as a valiant warrior, and rises in the ranks until Saul starts to see his right-hand man as a threat to his power. David does eventually become king, but only after years of civil war and life on the run. Years later, after David is comfortably settled on the throne of a reunited and increasingly centralized Israel, he decides that it isn't right for him to be living in this nice cedar palace while God's residence among the people is still this mobile tent that came with them from the Sinai wilderness. So David announces his intention to build God a house, a temple. That night, though, God speaks to the prophet Nathan. God, it turns out, doesn't need David to build God a house. Instead, God will build David a house, not a physical structure, but a dynasty. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, God tells David through Nathan. Your throne shall be established forever. Suddenly, this is a family that will have the honor and the responsibility of carrying a blessing through the generations. For a while, Israel enjoys a time of peace and prosperity, an era that future generations will look back on as a golden age. It's not so long, though, before we begin to realize that even this miraculous house has some cracks in it. It all starts when David sees Bathsheba, decides that she is going to be his, and then arranges to have her soldier husband accidentally die in battle. The man after God's own heart, as David is sometimes called, has apparently lost himself to his own power. This downfall, these cracks continue with David's half-hearted response to a crime committed by one of his own children against another, which leads the nation back down the road to civil war. David does prevail at the cost of his own son Absalom's life. And when David finally does die of old age, his son Solomon ascends to the throne. There is no denying the prosperity and splendor of Israel under King Solomon, but this too comes with a cost. Solomon's Israel is a place where the rich grow richer and the poor grow poorer, as they are heavily taxed and forced into work gangs to build the temple that David never did. When Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam comes to power, Rehoboam vows to rule with twice the iron fist that Solomon did. The people protest, and the kingdom splits in two. Descendants of the house of David will continue to sit on the throne in Jerusalem in the south for another almost 350 years. Most of them will not be people after God's own heart. The cracks in this miraculous house get wider and wider until the house can no longer stand. And it falls to the Babylonian army in 587 BCE. Most of the stories that we now read in the Old Testament are written and or compiled as people look back and say, a descendant of David was supposed to be on the throne forever. How could all of this have happened? How could all of this have happened? Back in Colombia, despite all of Mirabel's efforts, Casita eventually falls as well. In the aftermath of its collapse, we learn more about Abuela's story, how she and her husband fled their home with infant triplets in their arms as militias rode through, burning everything in sight. How her young husband turned back to defend his family from guerrillas on horseback. How that act of love cost him his life, but was also the source of the magic that made the amazing Madrigals. The story of the family Madrigal is a miraculous one, but it's also a story born out of trauma. And if we go back to David's story, perhaps it's not so hard to see it as the story of a miracle born out of and wrapped in trauma as well. This man after God's own heart, divinely chosen, who nevertheless found the road to kingship paved with violence and fear, and who will see that violence play out in his own family for generations to come. Psychologists tell us about this idea of intergenerational trauma, how the experience of trauma often doesn't just end with the person who experiences it directly, but how it comes to bear on the relationships of parents with their children, and then those children with their own children. This phenomenon was first studied in survivors of the Holocaust and their children, who showed symptoms of trauma despite having never lived through it themselves. Intergenerational trauma and its cousin, historical trauma, which can affect whole groups and demographics of people, can be important in understanding things like cycles of poverty and addiction and the wide-reaching effects of racial injustice in our country. I don't know how many of us would identify this kind of intergenerational or historical trauma as part of our own family stories. I know that there are those of us in this community who have experienced trauma directly ourselves. And all of us, every one of us, has undoubtedly experienced brokenness. Every one of us has stories that we hoped would go a different way than they did, with all of the grief and despair and guilt which comes with that. My point is not to say that we're doomed, destined to pass on the worst parts of our own histories and experiences to those who come after us. Now, obviously, these are incredibly complex issues, and I don't claim any expertise as a psychologist. But what I do believe as a matter of faith is that there is hope for all of the brokenness in our stories to be redeemed. I don't mean to say that that redemption will happen magically or overnight. It often happens as we come to know our own stories, as we confront our individual and collective pasts as individuals, as families, as a nation. It comes as we use all of the resources at our disposal to break harmful patterns and cycles and challenge systems that perpetuate violence and trauma, which we may even find that we're part of. God, I believe, is in this holy work, giving us hope for something new. In this season of Easter, we may be especially attuned to the ways God is bringing new life for us and for the world around us, and how we might be called to participate in that. For Abuela Madrigal, redemption comes through Mirabel and her willingness to confront the cracks in the family she loves. It comes through Mirabel understanding the trauma that is a part of Abuela's story and where her obsession over her family's magical perfection comes from. Redemption comes through breaking the pattern of pressure and fear and starting again on a new foundation. For David and his family, redemption comes as God's people reflect theologically on their history, as God brings them back from exile and allows them to start anew, even if things look somewhat different than they once did. And as we tell our story as Christians, redemption comes as once again a descendant of David is hailed as king. Jesus will claim the good and miraculous parts of his family's story and make that the new foundation for humanity's relationship with God. At the end of Encanto, the family Madrigal comes together to rebuild. Abuela and Mirabel sing a new song. Look at this home. We need a new foundation. It isn't perfect. Neither are we. That's true. No longer the amazing Madrigals, the perfectly normal Madrigals must now learn to live into a new story. And it's one that is filled with hope. As for David, he offered to build God a house. And God told David God would build David a house instead. But sometimes I think God says to us, why don't you build a house with me? It might not look like the place you've always lived, but it will be hopeful and beautiful. This new foundation that God promises. Amen.